I think it's just going to get weirder and weirder and weirder, and finally it's going to be so weird that people are going to have to talk about how weird it is. Eventually people are going to say, what the hell is going on? It's not enough to say it's nuts. You have to explain why it's so nuts. The invention of artificial life, the cloning of human beings, possible contact with extraterrestrials, the systems which are in place to keep the world sane are utterly inadequate to the forces that have been unleashed.
Welcome back to Forbidden Knowledge News. I'm your host, Chris Matthew. Today my guest is Neil Ward. First exciting news, Forbidden Knowledge News hit number 5 in the spirituality category on the Apple charts. So excited. Thank you all for listening. It is such a surreal thing to see. We are booking guests for November. If you have suggestions or you'd like to be a guest, email me, forbiddenknowledgenews@gmail.com. Check out my films. Doors of Perception is on Amazon Prime. Occult Louisiana is on Tubi, Roku channel, and more. Today I want to welcome Neil Ward. He is an author. He is host of the Paranormal Peep Show on the Paranormal UK radio network. He is an active paranormal researcher and has investigated UFOs, taken part in scientific ESP experiments, and studied mediums. Neil, welcome. How you doing?
Hello, Chris. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very well, thank you. It's great to be on your show, and I look forward to discussing many topics of the paranormal, which I hope your audience will find of interest.
I know they will, and I know I will as well. You've researched some fascinating paranormal cases, which we'll share a little bit today. You also share in your new book, True Tales of the Paranormal, as well as your upcoming book, Unsolved Modern Mysteries. Everything from fairy encounters to supergiant women on church roofs, Iranian soldiers encountering cloven-hoofed beings, Bigfoot, UFOs, and so much more. All of my favorite stuff. I can't wait to share some of these stories with the audience. But this is your first time on. Before we do, tell the audience a little bit more about yourself and let them know how they can find out more about you.
Okay, so I guess as we're on the paranormal subjects, we can sort of lead off from the paranormal area. I am a co-host of a podcast called the Paranormal Peep Show, which airs on the Paranormal UK radio network. And that is kind of a joint US stroke British enterprise, which has been going about nearly 10 years now. And I kind of joined in the early days as a guest, but they asked me to take over as a host. So I kind of said, yeah, okay, I'll give it a go. Because I worked in broadcast TV for many, many years, the kind of skills of editing and setting up things like technical stuff, kind of I can lean into it fairly well because I've got that background in TV and production and broadcasting, so they lend itself quite well to the world of podcasting, although it's a slightly different kettle of fish, but microphone's a microphone, etc. I've played in rock bands over the years. I'm a bass player predominantly, but I also dabble in keyboards a little bit, more for the home recording, or I have joined bands as a keyboardist, but I wouldn't call myself anything like a John Lord or Keith Emerson from Emerson, Lake and Palmer. And I'm also an artist, so I do lots of artwork. I've been doing it since I was a kid, do commissioned artwork, private commissions. I'm currently working on sketches, concept sketches for a children's book I'm working on at the moment, my own children's story book. And I also write about the paranormal, and we're going to be discussing those topics today through some of the books that I've recently had published.
Excellent. I'd love to know what got you interested in the paranormal and what led you to write these books in particular.
That's interesting. It's always a question that I ask other guests that I interview as well, because you think, how did you kind of come into this pathway? And it's always a very interesting thing. Did you see spirits? Did you encounter a Bigfoot? Or did you get abducted on board a UFO? Unfortunately, it was none of those things, great and interesting as they sound. But how I got into it was a curiosity, I suppose, because I grew up watching Star Trek as a kid, Doctor Who, science fiction shows, absolutely fascinated with that kind of stuff. But I was also interested in ghost stuff, although they were typically more scary to watch. But I remember asking my mum at a very young age, probably 8 or 9, Mum, where was I before I was born? And she said, well, you never existed. And I said, but I must have existed. And she says, no, you never existed. And I thought, well, okay, I don't remember not existing, but I must have been somewhere. And I didn't really kind of get an answer to that, but it kind of sat on me in my consciousness for a little bit. And as time progressed, I started to see books by an author called... well, and in fact, she was a medium foremost, a British medium called Doris Stokes, and she started to appear on the TV in the late 1970s on daytime shows doing mediumship, and that really intrigued me. And then we got some of the books in our family and started to read those. And also, we used to get the Reader's Digest magazine delivered, and sometimes they had these interesting articles in there about what happened to a person when they temporarily died on the operating table in a hospital, and they would go out of their body through a tunnel of light and maybe talk to someone on the other side. And that really intrigued me. So it was all these little things sort of jumping into my mind from various places that kind of got me thinking about, is there such a thing as an afterlife? What happens? Where do we go? And then there used to be other TV shows that would come on talking about like Bigfoot or UFOs, alien encounters. And that also intrigued me. So really, I kind of got the whole thing kind of brewing within my consciousness over the years. And I started to do shows with my artwork. I used to go to various pagan conferences, witch fest conferences, witchcraft shows, that kind of thing. And I used to display my artwork there and sell a few prints. And I found that if I offered to do a talk for the people that organized it, they would give me a free stall or booth, as you might say in the States, and they'd cover my fuel as well. So I had a few stories to my bow, as it were, by that point, of various ghostly encounters, of things I'd researched. And but I found a lot of people after each talk would come up to me and tell me their particular ghost story or their particular weird occurrence. Some were pretty substandard or average, but now and again you'd get absolute gems of stories, and you'd think, I've got to write this down. I've got to write this down. So eventually, when COVID came and everyone was locked down, I decided this is the point that I'm going to write this down. So I started to write this down as a book, and the original book was called Encounters with Fairies, Ghosts and Spirits, because I'm also interested in the world of fairies. And I then sent it around various publishers, and this publisher picked it up, and they said, we've actually got a book parked in our to-do list as such called True Tales of the Paranormal. We haven't actually got an author, but that is the working title we've got. And they said, your book could possibly fit into this title. Would you be interested if we made a few changes, changing the title and, making it a bit more up to date or PC or something like that? So I said, yeah, sure. So we went with that agreement, and that's how the True Tales of the Paranormal was born, basically.
Excellent. Well, I'd love to get into some of these stories without giving away too many from the book, but you've got so many, I think the audience would enjoy hearing a couple. Let's start with one that you wrote about in the email. An elderly lady in the 90s who saw a strange mist rise from her deceased husband's chest after he died. Tell us a little bit about this story.
Yeah, okay. So that was a personal story that I never read about. It was actually related to me by this lady. I was doing tarot card readings at the time. So I've studied mediumship by this point. Went to mediumship developing circles, psychic developing circles, as they call them. And one of the side sort of things of that is that you can learn to do tarot. And people were starting to come to me for tarot card readings. But this particular lady rang up and said, I'd like to have a tarot reading, but I don't drive. Can you come to me? And I thought, okay, it's not really kind of the way I do it, but I'll do it. But I'm so glad I did. So basically, I found her house, and this is before we had sat-navs. God knows how I found her house, but I found it. And she lived in a small bungalow, and I gave her the reading, and it was about 40 minutes long. And she said that was very accurate. So I said, thank you very much. And she said, but there's one thing you didn't mention. And I said, but what was that? And she says, well, my husband, did he not kind of make himself known to you? And I said, well, look, if I felt your husband around, I definitely would have mentioned him, but I didn't feel him around. So she goes, let me tell you something. And then she showed me the bedroom where she said her husband lay ill for a year in his bed. And she said he was so ill that he had to breathe with an oxygen mask because he was just so ill and poorly. And every day she used to lift him up and try and puff up his pillows to make him more comfortable. And on this particular day, she said she puffed up his pillows for him while she was leaning him forward, and he kept saying, "I feel so ill. I feel so ill. I just want to die." And she said at that literal point, as he said, "I just want to die," he literally just died in her arms, almost like the request had been granted from somehow. And so she laid him back down on the bed, and she said she saw this vaporous mist. That was the exact word she chose, vaporous mist, that came up out of his chest and it went up towards the ceiling and went down into the airing cupboard in the corner of the bedroom. And she says, "Now I'm going to tell you this." And she goes, "My doctor just laughed at me," because obviously she told her doctor, she felt that she's got to tell someone this. And so she thought she'll tell the doctor, he would understand. But she said, "He just laughed at me." She goes, "But I know you won't laugh." And she said 6 months later, I'd be woken up about 3 o'clock in the morning, and out of that same airing cupboard, she said, I saw, and it was her words, a red Indian coming out the cupboard. Now, this lady was probably about in her 80s, in the mid-90s, in 1995. Now, I kind of knew where she was coming from, and these days people say Native American or First Nation people, whatever word you want to use, but that's the kind of person she was describing, a Native American Indian coming out the cupboard. And she said she could see him very, very clearly. She could see the war paint on his face, as she described it as that. She said, I saw the feathered headdress, I saw a bone necklace around his neck, and he was bare-chested, but I couldn't see below the waist. It was like that was all foggy, but she could clearly see the top half of him. And she said that what happened as he came out the cupboard, he was waving his arms as if he was like almost like trying to crawl out or swim out, if you like, wading through something. And she said behind him, she saw another man who appeared to be in the shadows. And then behind that man was a third man who appeared to have some kind of hat on, but he was even in a darker shadows and she couldn't see him at all very clearly. But she could definitely see this, a Native American Indian trying to come out the cupboard. And she said it just didn't happen the once. It happened virtually every night. Wow. And she said, what is it? What's going on? I went, oh my God. I said, have you ever heard of a spirit guide? And she says, no. Now, by all accounts, this lady only dabblement with the paranormal was perhaps having a tarot card reading, and she might have read astrology signs maybe in the paper. That's as far as I'd put a kind of knowledge in these areas. So she had no idea what a spirit guide is. And for those that don't know what a spirit guide is, in the terms of spiritualism and mediumship, they talk a lot about spirit guides, and they tend to be people that have died and gone on to the next life, i.e. the spirit world. And if they're advanced souls, and typically the reason that Native American Indians come through is that they were more advanced on a spiritual level than, say, the average Westerner, if you like. So they would be much more in tune with nature, the harmony in nature, the cycles of nature. They'd also understand about the soul and the spirit a bit more. They'd talk about the great white spirit and that kind of stuff that helped nature, like their version of God, if you like. And so this basically was a description of a spirit guide that she was given, yet she had never heard of a spirit guide, and typically she'd never heard of Native American spirit guides, which are the most common ones reported being encountered in seances or with mediums that are describing their own spirit guide as a Native American. And here she was, one witnessing one coming through her airing cupboard. Now, why was it coming through her airing cupboard? Well, if we go back 6 months earlier to when her husband died and we saw the mist coming out of his body, or she witnessed it rather, she said the mist rose up to the ceiling and went into this airing cupboard. So I said to her, I believe you've got maybe something like a portal. And I said, you can picture it like a revolving doorway in a hotel lobby. I said, you can go in it, but you can also come out of it. And I said, I think that's where your husband's spirit, i.e. the mist that you saw, went. And I said, I bet he didn't believe in any of this kind of stuff, did he? The kind of stuff that we're discussing. She goes, no, he thought it was all rubbish. I said, that's probably part of the key. He possibly, because of his understanding, hasn't got the ability to come back literally under his own power. He perhaps needs the help of someone to assist him. And I said, I think this Native American is a guide of some sort, and he's helping your husband, who's possibly the man behind, and he's bringing him through. And she was trying to maybe witness that and engage with him in some way. So I said, maybe what you should do is try and talk to him, ask him questions. What do you want? Why are you here? That kind of thing. And I said, if you don't get any success, if you don't get any answers, then call up the College of Psychic Studies in London or the Spiritualist Association of Great Britain, places that deal with mediums and psychic matters all the time. And they might be able to give you a little bit more information than what I've given you. And also they may even be able to help. They even may send someone down to maybe check out your place or whatever, for whatever reason. And I left it at that. But I came away with kind of like, my God, this is quite an extraordinary tale, And I suspect this lady must have been slightly psychic herself to be able to witness this spirit coming through the doorway.
Now, let me ask you, did she describe the Native American as a normal sized apparition, the same size as a normal human? Was it smaller?
She never mentioned anything about his size. By all intents, it appeared to be the same size. It's coming through a framework of a door of a cupboard, which would probably range between 5 feet to 6 feet tall. And this Native American seemed to be coming through it with a headdress. I would say no problem at all, but he seemed to be struggling some way because he seemed to be wading his arms through it as if he was like swimming through treacle, perhaps, although there was no actual treacle there. But she said she couldn't see the legs. But it's interesting you mentioned the size of these spirits, because I did attend once what they call a physical seance in a place in Oxfordshire, in the southwest of the UK, many years ago, and I was asking the guy that ran this place, what's the most fantastic thing you've seen? And he said, well, he was there when they had a physical seance. That's where a materialized spirit will actually physically manifest using this material called ectoplasm. You might have heard that mentioned in Ghostbusters. It actually comes from a real stuff they call ectoplasm, which comes out of the medium, apparently. I've never seen it myself, but this is what they say. And he said that this spirit guide appeared, who was a Native American. He appeared to be at least 7 foot tall, really tall. And he said to this guy, who was like a normal guy that was in this seance, he says, "I want you to punch me in the chest." This spirit guide said to him. So this guy reluctantly punched him in the chest, and he said, "Hit me harder." And the guy was sort of thinking, "Okay, you're sure about this?" So he hit him a bit harder, and he goes, "No, hit me really hard." And so this guy punched him for a third time, really hard in the chest. Now, that would have knocked me and you probably flat on the ground by this point, or even, broken a rib maybe. But this guy said, "No, hit me as hard as you can." So this guy thought, okay. So he took one massive punch of this spirit guide, whacked him on the chest, and he didn't even rock backwards. And then suddenly this spirit guide just dissolved into the ground.
Whoa. Earlier, you mentioned fairies. This is always fascinating to me. Nature spirits, elementals, fairies. Maybe we could get into a couple of fairy stories.
Yeah, sure. So I start the book off with the elementals, the fairies, as they're commonly known, sometimes called the Fae. And there's a particular one story that occurred in Canada. Now, people can actually find out for this. They can read it in the book, but there is where I got the original source information from on that was from a documentary film called The Fairy Faith by Canadian filmmaker John Walker. And he went and interviewed various people from around the world, Canada, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, on what they said were encounters in some shape, way, or form with fairy beings. And this particular lady had gone to a favorite picnic spot in a lake in Canada, and she was with her children. I think she had 3 children at the time, and this was probably about the early 1980s, mid-80s. And they was having their picnic, and after the picnic, the young children wanted to paddle in the water. So the mother took them into the water, just up to their ankles, and they were paddling in the water. And all the while, the mother could hear this strange, weird music, and she couldn't place where it's coming from, but it made her feel very uneasy. And so she felt instinctively that she should not be around there. So she decided to get the kids back in the car. And she goes, "Kids, get in the car." And the kids didn't want to go in the car because they were paddling. And so she lost her rag, as we say. She shouted at them, she says, "Get in the car." So all the kids reluctantly got in the car. And she said to her eldest daughter, as they started to drive away, she goes, "Don't look out the window." Now, in this documentary film, they took the actual lady and her daughter, who was now growing up, back to that original location, and they were showing the film crew around where they had experienced this strange thing. And the daughter, who was now grown up, said, "I remember my mum saying, 'Don't look out the window,' but I had to. I just wanted to see what was there. And I looked." And she said, "I saw these small, maybe a foot high beings coming out of the woods into the pathway, and they're all hand in hand, and they were dancing round in a circle. And that's perhaps where this music was coming from. And they were coming down the pathway towards where the car and where their picnic had been. And that's the last she saw of it." So what would have happened to them had they stayed there? We don't know. I mean, they say that when you hear this fairy music, you got to beware, because you can get your senses lost. You become lost and you cannot find your way home. It's a very bizarre thing. Now, in the same documentary film, they also interview a guy from Glasgow in Scotland called Steve O'Dale, I think his name is. And he said that he had gone on holiday and he was by this mountain, which was strangely enough called the Fairy Hill or the Fairy Fort. And it had just been raining and the clouds were parting. And as the clouds were parting, a rainbow started to form over the valley. And as he stared over the valley, he looked at the unfolding view of the hills of Scotland. He thought, wow, that's a lovely sight with the sunlight coming through and the rainbow form. What a beautiful sight that is. And all the whilst he was admiring this sight, there was something distracting him in his peripheral vision. And he carried on looking at this scene, but all the while there was this thing out the corner of his eye moving. And he thought, what is that? And he suddenly looked down and he said where his foot was, he said there was a small woman about a foot high, and she had brown leathery looking skin, a pointy kind of leathery looking hat, and she even had like whiskers, almost like whiskers on her face. And he said that she had what appeared to be an old stylish pair of sheep shears. And this is where it gets freaky, and I tell people to buckle up because this is going to be a strange one. Buckle up. She appeared to be cutting around the sole of his shoe with these sheep shear style scissors. And he said that where his shadow extended, because the sun had now come out and cast a shadow, at the top end of his shadow was the male equivalent of this small brown woman. And this is where it gets weird. He was rolling up the guy's shadow like paper. What? Yeah, weird, isn't it? It defies physics. And he said, I didn't know what to say. All I could think of to say was, oi! And he said they looked at each other as if in surprise that, oh my God, he can see us. And then instantly, bang, they just vanished. Completely out of reality. They disappeared.
Wow.
And and you're thinking, well, how can you roll up a shadow?
Right.
Because it's not like paper, is it? But maybe in their world or part of their world, they can do something with it and steal it. And so that's why I called that part of the book The Shadow Stealers. Wow. Now, it's interesting because it had just been raining in this scenario, and so therefore the sun wasn't out. But as soon as the sun came out and started to cast a shadow with its bright light, it's like these people, whoever they were, these small beings, wanted that shadow for whatever reason. And it's like they were lying in wait, like hunters of a shadow, to capture it for whatever reason. And he actually said, I dread to think what would have happened if I hadn't have seen them. Right. What would have happened to me? Would they have stolen part of my soul, like vampires, but it's done in a symbolic shadow form? I mean, he wasn't really meant to see it anyway. Yeah. So yeah, it's just bizarre, isn't it?
It is absolutely bizarre, and I hear stories like this all the time where people will have these encounters with an intelligence or being. During the experience, it seems like their perception is hijacked and taken over to an extent where whatever they're interacting with can present itself as whatever it wants and can take over their reality in a way and affect it by changing things in very profound ways in that person's reality. So I find that very fascinating, how whatever these things are can completely take over our consciousness if they want.
Yeah, I mean, I was discussing this particular case with a guy who we interviewed about 8 months ago on our Paranormal Peep show, and his name was Simon. I forget his surname off the top, but he writes lots of essays about fairy research, and he gets people to write to him with their fairy encounters as well. And he said that there was one guy that wrote to him, and he said this guy had woken up and on his bed was a small brown being, and I think they're actually called brownies. That's the term given to them. And it was sitting on his bed looking at him, and it had like a bag in its hand, probably a leather bag or something, but it had a bag in its hand. And he said it looked at me like someone was eyeing up a horse for the market. So it was looking at him in some sort of sense of value or commodity of some sort, almost like a Ferengi would see gold or something of value. And it was eyeing him up, not as a person, but what could it get out of him and maybe market itself or profit from in some way.
That is so interesting. Before we move on from fairies and elementals, is there any other stories that really stick out in your mind at this time?
Yeah, so I mentioned there's an Iranian soldier that I met. He wasn't a soldier by the time I met him. So I was flying with my family at the time. This would be about 2007, 2008, on a holiday from London down to Spain. And everybody getting on the plane was mostly Spanish people, few English people. And one of the last people to get on the plane sat next to me. It was the last seat available. And we ended up chatting. And he was kind of dark skinned. And I assumed that he was Spanish. But he said, no, he said, I live in London. He said, but I'm from Persia, or what you might know today as Iran, but I prefer to call it Persia. And I said, oh, are you going on holiday? And he goes, no, I'm an architect and I'm going out to check on the properties that I've been designing to make sure the project's all good and happy type of thing. And anyway, he said, what do you do? So I said, well, I'm an artist. And at the time I ran this, a fairy museum to do with the legends of the Orkney Islands off the north coast of Scotland. And we ran this fairy museum for a few years. And it involved me doing lots of artwork to put on display there. And so I had lots of photographs on my digital camera. So I decided to show him a few drawings and things. And I decided, well, I'll tell him that really interesting story of the guy that was having his shadow stolen, which I've just related to you. And it kind of got him maybe to be a bit more confident. He didn't want his name revealed, but I said, could I use your story? Once he finally told me, he goes, yeah. So I gave him a sort of a fake name in the book, but it's there to protect his identity, basically. But this guy, he basically said that he was a young conscripted soldier back in Iran, and I had again put this in the early 1980s, and he was patrolling the streets late at night with an army buddy, and he said a sandstorm had kicked up, which is very common in those areas, sandstorms. And so he said him and his friend decided to kind of seek shelter from the sandstorm, and they found a mosque. So they went into this mosque, and as is the custom of mosques, you take your shoes off. So they took their shoes off, so they just had bare feet. And they both went into the mosque, and this guy, I'll call him Hussein, he said to his army colleague, okay, you lay down by the wall and have a sleep. I'll sit here with my gun, keep awake for any trouble. And then in an hour, I'll wake you up and it'll be my turn to have a sleep. So he says, okay. So they went like that for maybe half an hour. His friend fell asleep, and this guy Hussein, he was sitting there, and every time he couldn't help it, but he kept falling asleep, sitting upright. And he kept waking up thinking, I must stay awake, I must stay awake. And then again, he just fell asleep again. And he said on the third time, he woke up thinking, I must wake up. He woke up, and there were people there. And it was this lady who was crouching down, staring intently at his feet. And beside this lady was a young girl, he said about 11 or 12, crouching down as well by this lady, looking at his friend's feet intently. And they were just staring, looking at their feet. And he thought, who are they? Where have they come from? So he decided to try and wake up his friend who was fast asleep. And he said, with his elbow, he kept pressing onto his friend's chest. And he said, no matter how hard he pressed, his friend wouldn't wake up. So he decided that he was going to he was going to make a run for it. I don't know why he was going to make a run for it, because he had the gun, really. But he said he started to wrap the strap of the gun around his wrist so the gun wouldn't swing as he ran. I still find this part incredible. You're the guy with the gun, but you're going to run away. And you don't know what these people are doing. They've not threatened you in any way. They're just staring at your feet, but he wanted to run away. And he said that movement must have triggered this woman to look up, because she looked up at him. And he said, as soon as I made eye contact with her, he said, I just knew something inside of me connected with her, and I knew that she wasn't from this world. She was not from this world. And he said at that point, she stood up and the young girl stood up and they walked away. And he said, as they walked away, he noticed they both had cloven hooved feet as they walked through the wall of the mosque and vanished.
Through the wall of the mosque? Wow.
Yeah, with their cloven hooved feet. And when he told me that, a shiver did run up and down the back of my spine with that one, I must admit. But then when you come to analyze the story again, you think back and you're thinking, so hang on a minute. If these people had cloven hooved feet, the human feet that Hussein and his friend had, to them, would be the oddities. Yeah. What are these strange toed things that are here that these people have got? Not like our cloven hooved feet that we've got. You know, and I'm simulating what they would be saying, of course. Who knows how they would think, but they certainly seem to be curious about the human look of the foot. And so it also lends rise to the fact that you got these legends of people with cloven hooves like Pan. Where does that legend come from? And then you got other strange mythical creatures. And so in the book I discuss mythical creatures. Is there some credence to them? Have they somehow intruded into our reality on occasion and been sighted by people? And we see them as mythical creatures, but they might be an alternative kind of race of people that have developed on an alternative pathway to the earth, like a probable earth, probable realities, ghostly realities. Who knows? We tend to think, there's the spirit world above us and we've got this world, but I think there's many, many other worlds and dimensions that we're unaware of, but somehow there's leaks in them, or doorways, pathways back and forth. And so maybe these people pop into our reality from time to time as visitors because they're curious. And maybe being a mosque of a holy building where prayers are said on a regular basis, maybe that's generated some sort of energy there. And I'll talk about that energy in another religious sense on a church building later on. But whilst we're on the subject of these kind of cloven-hoofed creatures, I did say this particular talk at a place in the north of England some years ago. And after my talk again, people came up to me to tell me their strange stories. And this lady came up and she goes, I'm so glad you mentioned those cloven-hoofed creatures because I know I'm not going mad. And I said, well, what do you mean then? She says, well, some years ago, I was in hospital and I gave birth to a dead baby, unfortunately. And I had to try and come to terms with it. And they put me in this room by myself. And in the cot was the dead baby. I could look at it and cuddle it and hold it if I wanted to. But she says, most of the time I just sat on the bed with my head in my hands thinking, how am I going to be strong for my husband and my family when I'm in this particular state of mind? And while she's in this kind of very distraught frame of mind, she said she noticed the door open and in came, and she didn't get a full tally of the number exactly, but she estimated it to be 4 or 5 small centaur beings. And they had kind of like bodies of horses or something, goats or something, but they seem to have human torsos, rather like the centaurs that you might have seen in Harry Potter or a Ray Harryhausen movie, perhaps. And they all came in. She goes, 2 of them looked and peered in at the cot where the dead baby was, and the other 3 kind of just stared up at me as I had my head in my hands, and I looked at them in absolute wonderment. And she says they weren't pretty things at all. They were very, very ugly creatures. And they just stared at her. But she said, after a while, she doesn't remember what happened. She doesn't remember them going away. She doesn't remember them vanishing. They just weren't there after a while. It's almost like she went into some sort of weird trance and kind of lost her senses a little bit, and it had all gone. But she said suddenly she felt a lot stronger and a lot more capable of dealing with life from that point on. So was it in some way some healing force that these centaur beings had given to her in some way? She wasn't sure, but she thought, is she going mad? And she always questioned herself. And then when I gave this talk on Hussein and his cloven-hooved creatures in the mosque, she knew. She said, I know I'm not going insane now. So I know there's other people that have seen these things or similar things out there. And so that kind of gave her a little bit of confidence that the world is strange, but, it's not you that's going crazy. Maybe it's the world that's crazy for not believing in these things.
Do you think we're dealing with the same phenomena when we look at things like fairies and these cloven-hoofed creatures and possibly UFOs? It does seem that there is an ecosystem of intelligences and life forms just beyond our perception that can somehow present themselves to us in a way or come into our reality, but they have such a spectrum of phenomena when you look at people's experiences with otherworldly beings, especially the abduction experiences where people are taken on craft, and you hear about the same types of beings being interacted with, like the big-eyed gray alien beings or the mantis beings. You have these very profound similarities, but then you have the crossover experiences where it can seem very much like an alien abduction experience, but there are different beings involved, or a different scenario, or you're not taken on a ship, you're taken to a different realm. Could it be that we're dealing with the same type of phenomena that presents itself in different ways, or is it a spectrum of different types of events happening?
Now, that's a good point. Now, that point has been raised by people in the past, such as John Keel, who was the author of the Mothman Prophecies. He looked into those kind of things. He called them not extraterrestrials, he called them ultra-terrestrials, and he wondered if they were for some other place, not necessarily from outer space or other solar systems or galaxies, but wondered if they had come through from some other dimensional realm. And he kind of wondered if, for instance, the Bigfoot that was often encountered with a lot of these landed saucers was there as a distraction. So they would maybe take a Bigfoot or land near a Bigfoot, we're not quite sure, and people would see the Bigfoot, and these aliens could then, whilst the Bigfoot's distracting these people, these aliens could get on with whatever they want to do. But that's not the whole case, because obviously a lot of these aliens, and we're calling them aliens because we don't know what else to call them, ultra terrestrials, whatever, but I'll say aliens because people are more familiar with that term, are actually now engaging with the human race in some way. Not everyone, but a lot of people. And there are certainly stories from the past, as covered by John Keel and Jacques Vallée in his Road to Pascagoula, I think it's called. Pascagoula, Pascagoula, I think it's something else. But anyway, he wrote a book on these things and asked are we dealing with modern day fairy encounters? The fairy sightings of people, they were small beings, they would take you away, you would have missing time, you wouldn't be in your right frame of mind. They would do things to you. They would maybe give you food to eat or something like that, and you go into some weird kind of strange mental kind of situation. You might come back a few days later totally disorientated. There did seem to be quite a lot of kind of similarities between a lot of these old age folk tales of fairy beings and more modern interpretations. But it's interesting that as we go through the ages, these craft have kind of changed with the ages. So, for instance, in the 1800s, you would get these what people thought were airships flying over the United States, but they would fly at incredible speeds. Now, they called them airships because they didn't have the word for flying saucer or aeroplanes at that time. But these airships seem to almost have, by the descriptions, of a steampunk Jules Verne type of thing going on there with them. And typically these craft would land and they would be humans on board. Sometimes they would they would look slightly oriental to people, and other times they might look like they were Mexican or possibly Spanish. They never gave any clues to where they came from, but typically when they were encountered, they always seemed to be typically fixing the craft in some way, which I thought was a bit odd. In most of these cases at that time, and in more recent cases, there's cases where that these people have said that, oh, they seem to be fixing or tinkering with one end of the craft or for some reason. And you're thinking, surely these craft can't be faulty all the time. I mean, every time you park your car up, you've not got the bonnet of your car up all the time you're parking, and you're there with a spanner fixing it every time you just go to the store. So I wonder if this is more of a psychological maneuver on the part of these occupants, so that when you encounter them and they know you're coming up in them, that they're not going to be threatening in any way. And it's their particular way of saying, oh, we're not really minding you much. We're too busy with our craft. And they're pretending to fix their craft. And they know that you would interpret that as looking and tinkering with mechanics of some sort. So they're kind of almost simulating what us humans do. They're acting like the humans, tinkering and fixing things. So they're almost like very human-like. And so therefore they might be interpreted more as friendly folk. They haven't got weapons in their hands or things. They're just doing stuff under the bonnet, so to speak. And they might say, oh, do you know where we could get some water from? Or in the case of one encounter, they asked for bluestone, and they gave the guy some coins and things to pay for it as well. And this is in the 1800s. And they say, well, where are you from? And they said, oh, well, we've just come from Illinois or whatever, and tomorrow we'll be in Athens in Greece, and you're thinking, my God. So they never mentioned flying back to Fairyland or some outer space place. They seem to be touring over the whole of the world, if that was the case. But I mean, who's to know whether they were true in the sense of what they tell is the truth, and sometimes you see these beings and you don't get a word out of them. I mean, there was a case in 1916 where in the First World War, on the east coast of United Kingdom, an area known as East Anglia, it was this lady was in a local village, and she had the village was called Aldeburgh, I think it's called Aldeburgh. She was upstairs cleaning her bedroom, and it was around lunchtime. There weren't many people in the village because a lot of people were fighting in the First World War, or they're in factories building ammunition or tanks or wherever it may be, or they're out fishing. So it's a very, very quiet sort of village street. And she said she suddenly noticed this what she described as a flying platform coming up the street at rooftop height. And if you think of a play park with a children's roundabout, it was almost like that. It was a very flat disc, but it had men standing on it, she said. It was men just like us, this lady said. Mrs. Whitelands, her name was. And they appeared to be holding onto a handrail. She assumed it was made of brass, but it could have been made of some other metal. And they appeared to have some kind of uniform on, and they had small hats on. So she thought they were maybe something to do with the German military or the Navy, because they had blue uniforms. But she heard no sound coming from this device as it flew overhead. They didn't seem to be bothered with her looking out the window. They didn't talk to her or wave to her. They just seemed to be looking down at the street below. And she said she tried to look between the legs of the men to see if there's some kind of engine or propeller, any kind of machinery that would make this thing fly, but she saw nothing. It was just silently gliding, and then it took a sharp turn to the right just as it reached her house, and then turned up the road and headed out towards the sea. And that's the last she saw of it. She didn't know what it was.
It's stories like those that make me wonder how much of a human element is involved with the UFO phenomenon. I do believe that we have been trying to reproduce craft or reverse engineer exotic technology for a while. I think we have exceeded, whether we got that technology from extraterrestrials or spirits or just advanced humans, some kind of information field. I know we have very advanced exotic technology. We have for a while. And there has been reports of human involvement with extraterrestrial abduction cases. People will not only report gray beings, but military personnel being involved with the experimentation that they are being subjected to during these experiences. So that sends up red flags for me, makes me wonder how much our military has been involved and is still trying to skew the UFO narrative.
Yeah, I mean, there are cases, and you've got these people like the whistleblowers, like Bob Lazar, and more recent cases of people coming forward saying there are things being uh, back engineered or simulated. Um, I mean, it's interesting in that case that they appear to have some sort of uniform on, but why would they do it so openly? There was no attempt to cover them up under some sort of canopy. They would just
Yeah.
stand on this small platform openly cited by the lady. It made me wonder, it's not possibly a craft that would go into outer space because it had no kind of capsule for a pressurized station or anything like that for a vacuum. And the fact that she said she saw it heading out to sea suggested to me that there might have been a craft out of there, like something like a submersible craft, not necessarily a submarine as we understood it. This is the First World War, but submersible that probably high technology this craft could possibly land on and then submerge below the sea. So this was more like a small scout craft. Um, when people think of flying saucers, they automatically assume that flying saucers have flown from one galaxy to another and they've come in that craft. But if you think about it, when say you've got an American aircraft flying out in Iraq or Afghanistan, that aircraft has not necessarily flown all the way from the United States over to Iraq. It's come on an aircraft carrier, which is out at sea, hasn't it? It might be 20 miles out at sea, off the Gulf Coast somewhere, and then it flies in and then goes back out to sea to land on again. So it kind of bears a sort of resemblance to that kind of idea of how they're doing things. They're going back to something that's possibly out to sea. Now, back in about 1953, 54, in London, a similar craft was seen flying over the trains of London, and it was seen by a Reverend Pith Kelly, who was sitting there, and as the train had stopped by a certain stop, he noticed a craft of similar description hovering over a viaduct, which is where a body of water is again. So there's water connections between both of these craft. And on this one, the men had khaki coloured uniforms, and there's possibly about 20 of them on board. And it was just hovering for maybe 4 or 5 minutes whilst he was there on the train until the train went away. He lost sight of it. So how long it was there, we don't know, but he at least saw it for 4 minutes. Again, it would have been in full sight of everybody else on the train. Bizarre as it was, and here it is in the middle of London. And it's like more than 40 years later after the Second World War. But nothing has come to light with any device like that that's got 10, 15, 20 men that floats around cities or towns or over rivers or over seas that looks anything like that. And so that's the only two cases that I've found where you've got people on this flying platform holding onto handrails of some kind, and they seem to be very human looking, which is even more incredible.
That is incredible. I want to go back to some of the other strange stories that you cover in the book. One in particular about a giant woman on a church roof. Tell us a little bit about this.
Yeah, so this is a very strange one. I worked, as I mentioned in my introduction about myself, in broadcast TV, and one of the places I was working at was in an evening shift that I was working, and they had a security guard there called Owen, and he was in the staff canteen, and I overheard him talking to a lady, and all I heard was the word saying she was white as that fridge freezer, and he's pointing to a fridge freezer that was in the staff canteen. And I thought, oh, that sounds spooky, whatever he's talking about. I'm going to ask him what he's talking about. I said, what are you talking about? Being nosy. And he goes, this woman I saw. I said, oh, yeah. I said, what happened then? And he said, well, when I lived in, and I think he lived in one of the Caribbean islands, and it might have been St. Lucia, but I'm not 100% certain, but it's one of the Caribbean islands. And he said that he was coming out of a bar one night with his friend. Now you think, oh, well, they've obviously been drinking, but I looked into the whole thing of drinking. Drinking does not cause hallucinations, visual ones. It might cause minor hallucinations of auditory hallucinations, like you think you might be hearing a voice calling you, but it may not be there. But you don't hallucinate objects or people or anything like that. But it's always the quickest thing that skeptics go to, saying, oh, they were drinking, that's why they saw it. But there's no proof that the drinking will cause that. Now, had they been drinking perhaps in medieval times, when the drinking was a lot different, when they used to put mushrooms in alcoholic drinks then, they might have had a good reason to suspect they were seeing
something. It seems like with your modern alcohol, you would
times,
notice less instead of being
Yeah.
perceptive to more.
Yeah. Yeah. We'd all be hallucinating strange things if there was
Yeah, right,
stuff in our alcohol. So anyway, he was coming out of this bar with his friend, and they're going the typical route home back to their houses. And as they come up the hill and as they round the corner, he said, "I saw this woman sitting on the church roof," and I laughed. And I said, "What do you mean? What's a woman doing sitting on the church roof?" And he says she was no ordinary woman. She was at least 50 foot tall. And he says she was as white as a fridge freezer. She had long white hair, very pale white skin, a long white kind of robe, and she was crouched and sitting over the church roof, almost like as if it's a doll's house. And I said, "Well, what happened?" He said, "Well, I saw my friend and I both saw it, and we both sort of stopped in our tracks." And he said his friend was so frightened, his friend hid behind a gravestone. Wow. So he automatically knew that his friend could see it. And he says, "Can you see what I'm seeing?" He goes, yeah, I see it too. So they both agree with each other that they were seeing the same thing. So if it was a hallucination, they would not
How
be
far
seeing
away
the same
were they
thing.
from the church itself?
I would say as they came around the corner, they might have been about 100 feet, maybe, something like that. But he never went into the details of how far he was. But I would say he's within certainly stone throwing distance, because what he decided to do was picked up a stone or a rock that he found in the graveyard. This is brave of him. He decided to throw this stone at this 50-foot giant, which I wouldn't advise listeners to do. And I said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, the stone went straight through her, but then she got up." So he obviously peed her off slightly, and she got up and started to walk towards them, which sounds terrifying. You've got a 50-foot woman, you've just thrown a stone at, and she's walking towards you. This is why I wouldn't advise it. So he said, as she started to walk towards us, she started to shrink in size and came down to the size of a normal person, and eventually just dissolved into the ground and faded away.
Wow.
Never to be seen again. But the interesting thing is that he said, "I don't believe in ghosts and ghoulies and things that go bump in the night. I don't believe they exist." And yet here he was describing this weird, ghostly, giantess encounter, and his friends saw it too. But he still said, "I don't believe them." It's almost like he was in denial about the whole thing. But it's interesting. Again, that was on a church, and the strange beings that we heard about in the mosque, examining the feet that had the cloven feet, that was in a religious building as well. So does having some sort of religious ceremony, building, prayer or something have something to do with it? I did read in a John Keel book, as we mentioned John Keel earlier, that John Keel cited a case, I forget where it was now, but it was in the 1960s, I think, where lots of people saw a giant lady also on a church roof, and she was there for an hour at least. So it's not the unique case that you might think it be. It seems to be kind of not super common, but it's not totally out the realms of impossibility, although it sounds impossible, but these people have seen these things as well. And when I mentioned this story to a fellow paranormal researcher called Andy Thomas, he mentions a friend of his who's a guitarist in a band he's played with for many years. And this guy is apparently very skeptical and straight, and, he won't take any nonsense. But he said that when he was a teenager, he was walking through some lanes on the way home with his 4 friends, so he had some witnesses with him, and they came across what they saw as something like a 40-foot giant standing on the hill in a field, screaming up at the sky. Whatever, he had some issue with the sky, and he was screaming up in it. And he said that all the cows were absolutely terrified, and they were running away from this giant man, and the teenagers also started to run as well, but they all witnessed it. But even after that, he said there must be some logical explanation that explains it. In other words, it's not ghosts, it's not spirits, it's not supernatural beings. It's probably some big balloon man or some big prop they're making a movie. He would try and sort of explain in those kind of terms,
Well, that is not the first story I've heard of giant sightings. I heard one of my friends tell me a story about these 2 gentlemen that were exploring swamps in, I believe it was Louisiana after a hurricane, and they came to an area that was not accessible before the storm and hadn't been for a very long time, and people hadn't accessed that area for a while, and they claimed they saw a giant man that was as tall as a tree peeking at them from behind the tree, and it scared them so much they took off as fast as they could in their boat. But you also hear the Kandahar giant story and plenty of others that have claimed to witness these very large humanoids.
Yeah, I cover the Kandahar giant in my Modern Unsolved Mysteries book, which is coming out in October, funny enough. And there's not a lot of information on that, but I've been doing some research, and certainly the people that initially discovered the story said that when they interviewed the soldier who claimed to be the guy. So basically, for those that don't know what the Kandahar giant story is, Kandahar is in Afghanistan, and it was around the earlier time when it was the coalition of the willing, I think it was called, going into Afghanistan after 9/11 to try and hunt down bin Laden and hunt down the Taliban, who were believed to be harboring him. And they were basically trying to bring them to justice, and they were looking in all sorts of caves and things. And they had this kind of unit that had gone out looking, presumably for bin Laden or whoever, and they'd gone missing. So they had to send out another kind of squad to go and try and locate them. And they came across areas where there was broken radios and helmets and even fragments of human bone. And suddenly out of this cave jumped this super 20 foot giant, maybe 15 foot, not quite sure the exact height, long red hair, almost like a caveman type of thing, but he had one of these great big spears, and he basically lanced one of the spears into one of the guys. Now, as this guy soldier that was relating the story said about that particular point, this guy was very emotional when he related that point to the researchers. And it's clear that, he knew this guy well that was killed by this giant. He was very, very emotional about it. And they said that's something you couldn't really fake. That came across as really genuine. And so basically they all opened fire on this giant. And one of them said, aim at the head. And they shot at the head. And after maybe about 30 seconds, they brought this giant down. And they noticed peculiar details about this giant that you wouldn't make up. They noticed it had 6 fingers on each hand. They noticed it had 2 sets of teeth. But also noticed around the toes it had an almost fungal infection. Now, if you're going to make up a story about a giant, would you say, oh, it had a fungal infection? No, you wouldn't even think to do it. But this guy noticed it because they had to wait with this thing for maybe an hour until a helicopter came and bagged it up and took it back to base, basically. Right. And they even had people that were on the either the helicopter pilot or the Hercules aircraft pilot that later took it back to the United States. They saw it as well under a tarp, on a big platform or something, and they took a look at it. So they also supported the story. But of course, the Department of Defense deny any such knowledge of things. And basically, when this unit was asked to write up their reports, they were told, no, you can't write that in your report. You've got to change it. They were given their chain of command said you're not going to mention anything about giants at all. And so that was it. The story is wiped clean from the official records, but unofficially the story started to leak through. And there are backup pieces of evidence from other sources in that region where people were using night scopes to hunt out the Taliban. And on occasion they'd see a fire in a distance, maybe 2 miles away, and they'd be watching the fire, and then they'd see a being stand up from the fire and walk, and they could tell that this being from the trees and things was at least 15 to 20 foot tall. So other giants were known in the region. And there's even a guy, I think in the States now, but he's originally from Afghanistan, who said that his grandmother used to warn him about not going into the caves because of these giants are in the hills, and they used to take goats out there and leave them as offerings or something. It sounds exactly like a Ray Harryhausen movie. It sounds absolutely crazy, but that's the giant of Kandahar story, and I mention it in the book. But if you don't believe it, you don't believe it. I can't prove it. It's just one of those things that circulate, isn't it?
It is absolutely crazy. We got time for another story. Let's hear about the Dottlestone messages in 1984.
Okay, so this is coming back to the UK now. So in Dottlestone, which is a village on the Welsh-English border, so it's kind of just below Manchester in the north of England, straddling on the Welsh border of England and Wales. And this teacher called Ken Webster had just moved into a cottage in the village of Doddleston, and he was teaching at a local school. And at that time, this would be about 1984, in the winter of 84, they started to be given, schools were given BBC home microcomputers. So the BBC, along with a company, got to get together to develop these basic PCs that were more like a DOS kind of program rather than the Windows-based computers that came on later on. And you could kind of write things on there like documents and save them to a floppy disk. And it's a very, very basic kind of thing. So he was allowed to bring one home to mess around on it, to learn it, so that then he could teach the students. And he thought there was a girl that was staying with him for a while that she wanted to write her comedy scripts on. She was an aspiring actress, and she wanted to write her comedy scripts on it. So she was allowed to use it and type her comedy scripts on this thing, provided she saved it to the disk. It was all good. So sometimes they would go off to the pub and come back, and they'd see the computers left on, and they'd see the scripts had been left on, and they'd been saved to the disk and everything. But now and again, they'd find strange writing on there saying, "Who are you? Does that? Thou hath a horse," and stuff. "What are you doing in my cottage?" And it would sign it LS, just the initials LS. And they thought, someone's having them on. Someone's broken into the cottage, typed a weird message, and someone at the school where this Ken Webster worked looked at the scripts. They printed it off, and he said, "This looks to me what they call early modern English." So it's as the English language developed in England, you had Old English, and then you had early modern English, which kind of came from that. And they couldn't really understand what these words were at, but this guy could understand it. He'd got like degrees in history and everything like that, and he managed to use with dictionaries. He used to start to translate what these words were meaning, and it basically transcribed that there was this person who called himself Lucas, who was writing from the year 1580 or something like that, in medieval times. But he was saying that he lived in the same cottage that Ken and his partner Debbie were living in now in 1984, and he said he could see them walking around his house, and they were doing a lot of renovation work there. And he said, "Why are you doing this to my house?" He saw them as invaders in the house. So it's almost like as if somehow there was a bleed through time, and he saw them as ghosts or invaders or devils or something like that in his house. Wow. But somehow he was able to use some device which he called a Leem's Boist. Now you think, what on earth is a Leem's Boist? But the very clever English teacher back at the school worked out that a Leem's Boist, using the Oxford dictionary, meant box of lights. And it's all right, my dog's now trying to eat my sandwich, which is on my plate. So I thought she wasn't going to pester me, but when there's food, yeah, she does want to pester me. So basically, this Leem's Boist was a strange box of lights, and he basically said that some being materialized in his fireplace in a blaze of green light and handed him this box of lights, and nobody else could see it, only he could see it, and somehow it operated when you spoke. And so when you spoke into this, and he discovered it because his young maidservant would be singing as she went round the house doing her chores, and this would produce the words. He would see the words appear in the air, not on a screen, but it seemed to have lights coming from somewhere. Huh. And so he they started dialoguing each other through time, basically, but it seemed to have elements of a poltergeist going on. So things would be moved around the house. Things would be stacked up in the corner. The chairs would be all piled high in one corner of the room when they came back. They even called in people to investigate from the paranormal societies and supernatural societies, and they couldn't understand what was going on. And it still became a mystery. No one absolutely solved it. And people have gone to forums and said, "Oh, he must have been using a modem or something, this Ken Webster, and has just faked the whole thing." But Ken Webster said, since that time, he's in the second edition of the book, The Vertical Plane, that's the book, if people want to look into it further, The Vertical Plane by Ken Webster, is that he said if he was using a modem, and they had no idea what a modem was in 1984, He said it would have cost him in dial-up terms, obviously because we had no broadband or anything. If you just dial up on the computer, it would have cost him in the region of about, in 1984 money prices, about £84,000 to do this big joke. And he said, why would he spend that amount of money on a teacher's salary to do this big joke to fool people? And so you've had people trying to work out what's going on. Very, very clever people in many later years have gone through and examined all these texts in the book and tried to work out if there's any clues. And one of the strange things that came out of this was that as well as Lucas writing in the year 1584 or whenever it was, there was a being that was also interceding or intercepting the messages from the year 2185 or some 2135. I can't remember the year now, but it's some year in the future. And it was sort of hacking into the messages, if you like. And it was sort of saying the whole thing is an experiment to do with time. So it's someone in the future and someone in the past and someone in the present of 1984.
So the messages would first show up on the microcomputer, and then it would start manifesting in the home in different ways?
Yeah, so eventually they boxed the computer up, and they became concerned that this being from the year 2135, say, was somehow hacking into the messages that Lucas was writing from the Middle Ages. So Lucas in the Middle Ages would start to write on pieces of paper in his own time, and then these pieces of paper would appear, they said, on modern day paper in the cottage.
Wow.
Somehow it could appear in the cottage. So it's very bizarre. You can't call it a straightforward ghost story or poltergeist story. It's got all sorts of things going on, the elements of time travel.
Yeah.
And he also said, this Lucas, that he wrote a book of his experiences with Ken and Debbie. And he wrote the book and he's hidden it somewhere so that in our present time, someone will find the book and find that it was all true. But to date, that book hasn't turned up yet.
Well, this is fascinating, Neil. Thank you for sharing this with us. Before we let you go, remind the audience how they can get a hold of your book and anything else you have out there that you'd like to share with the audience.
Thank you. So basically, if people are interested in the first set of stories, which is called True Tales of the Paranormal, I look into mediumship, fairies, ghosts and spirits, all kinds of sort of things, and even I cover UFOs in that. It's True Tales of the Paranormal. You can buy that on your major bookseller stores, Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and maybe a local bookshop you can order it from under the name of Neil Ward, and it's published by Arcturus Publishing. And Arcturus Publishing then commissioned me to write a second book, which is shortly coming out in October 2025, and that is called Modern Unsolved Mysteries. And that covers all sorts of mysteries, including the book we just mentioned that was, sorry, not the book, the Doddleston Mysteries, which is the computer writing through time. And we also talk about the Giant of Kandahar in there and other strange mysteries that have yet to remain to be solved.
I love it. Some of my favorite things to discuss, Neil. We'll have to have you back. So much more we can get into. And until next time, everyone, have a wonderful evening. We will talk again tomorrow. We'll see y'all then.